Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf tzaditet. We're going to start from the very top of our daf. Our Mishna had said that, oh, 1 second, my dedications. I forgot for a minute. Today's learning is sponsored by Lori Shulden of Shiur on the occasion of her 65th birthday, with gratitude for access to meaningful learning and with appreciation for the love and support of my family and friends throughout the years to this very day, Ad Hayom Hazeh. Today's daf is sponsored by Diane Kusher in loving memory of Dennis. Today was Dennis's birthday. He was 6 months older than me, both being born in 56. He died at 65 2 years ago. On June 6th, in 2 years' time, we will complete the daf Yomi learning cycle of 7.5 years. I thank Hadran for the support, Rabbanit Michelle, and all the dafers. Okay, we're going to get started with our Mishnah had discussed at what point does a shoel, when somebody borrows an item, we've already been learning this for a while, the shoel assumes responsibility even for unexpected damages. So the big question becomes, what is the moment at which the shoel accepts the responsibility? Obviously, if the one who's lending the item passes the item to the shoel and the shoel does a kinyan on it, meshicha, something like that, pulls the item, obviously the shoel is responsible. But what if it's sent by a messenger, by somebody else? So the issue became in the Mishnah, it all depends. If the person lending it sent it without telling the shoel or without getting the approval of the shoel, then it continues to be the responsibility of the person who sent it. But if the shoel either said, send it with someone to me, the borrower says, send it with someone, or the lender says, I'm going to send it with this person, and the shoel says, sure, send it. As soon as the shoel, the borrower, says, I agree, the shoel is responsible. Now, according to this, we said, let's go back to one of the halachot we mentioned, which is, in the case, let's assume you're lending me an item. So you lend me an item, and you say, I'm going to send it with my eved. That's the one we're going to talk about, your slave. We assume what kind of slave? There's 2 different kinds of slaves. There's Jewish slaves and there's Canaanite slaves. We never really know when they say slave what they're referring to. More often, it's a Canaanite slave. And it basically says in the Mishnah that you send it with your, let's assume, we'll plug in Canaanite slave. Now, what's the difference between Canaanite slave and Jewish slave? There's many differences, but one of the main differences is that a Jewish slave is considered like somebody who works for you. And a Canaanite slave is considered a household member, and not only just a household member, but also as an extension of the owner, him or herself. So what's the relevance of that? We'll see in a minute. It says in the Mishnah that if you send the item with your Canaanite slave, and I say, sure, send it with your Canaanite slave, then I become responsible as soon as you give it to the Canaanite slave. To which the Gemara asks, how could that be? And they quote that line which says, Biyad avdo chayav, if you send it with your eved, right? If I asked for it, or if you decide to send it and I say, sure, send it with your eved, how could I be liable? Yad eved ki yad rabo. This is a way of saying that this literally means the hand of the eved is like the hand of the master, which basically means that the eved is like the master. If you pay the eved a salary, it goes straight to the master. So that means basically they're owned by, even though we always have difficulty with this, and nowadays there is no such thing. Even many generations ago, the Rishonim even said, isn't anymore such a thing as Canaanite slaves. But in those days, there was this concept, and the slaves were owned by the master, which means that the slave is really an extension of the master halachically. So if the slave is an extension of the master, then it's as if the lender hasn't given up rights to it. If the lender's still holding the item in the lender's hand, then of course I'm not responsible for onus. So if you still are holding it, even though, right, if you send it with your eved, it's as if you're holding it yourself. So how could we possibly say I become liable for onus if it's really like it's still in your property? So Amar Shmuel, be'eved ivri, here's a very simple answer. This isn't an eved Canaanite. It's an eved ivri. It's a Jewish slave. Dilo kane le gufe. What's the uniqueness of a Jewish slave compared to a Canaanite slave? As we said, his body is not owned by the master. He's considered an independent person. So when you gave it to someone else, it's no longer in your possession. However, Rav disagrees, and Rav wants to explain the Mishnah that it is a Canaanite slave. So Rav Amar, afilu tema be'eved Knaani, na'aseh ke'omer le hikisha b'makel v'tavo. So in order for Rav to explain this Canaanite slave, and if we hold Yad Evet Ki Rabo, how could it possibly be? It sounds like it's still in the hands of the lender. How could the borrower possibly be responsible? So he's going to say, by giving it to your slave, even though generally we say Yad Evet Ki Rabo, it's like a case is critical because we're going to change this later, but it's like a case where I said, oh, I want to borrow your animal, and you know what? Hit it with a stick, which means prod the animal to come to me and just let it go by itself. Which means, okay, now what's the connection to the slave? Well, if I say I agree you send it with your slave, it's like I'm saying I agree for you to send it by itself. If you want to send the slave to kind of watch it as it goes, sure, go for it. But what it really means is, and some of the commentaries explain, my responsibility is not midin from the laws of I'm a shoel and I'm chayav in ones, because I'm not really, because it's still an extension of you and it's still in your hands, so to speak. But if I say, yes, you can send it with your eved, it's like I'm saying, okay, and they even use the word guarantor. It's like I'm guaranteeing a loan. It's like I'm saying, I accept responsibility from the moment you give it to the slave. Even though maybe the slave is like an extension of you, this is almost saying like, yeah, it's true, but in the end, you are two separate people. It's not really the same as it being in your hands, because when I agreed for you to let it go in the hands of your slave, it was like I'm saying, let the animal come on its own, and I'm assuming responsibility. That's a way of basically me saying, I'm going beyond the letter of the law and I'm assuming responsibility. But since I did it, right, since I accepted it, that becomes law. So now the Gemara doesn't like this, because the Gemara says, Metzia, this contradicts this. We're going to have a problem. Okay, you're going to have to wait a minute or two to see the issue. But we're now going to quote another source, which seems to contradict our Mishnah. And then we'll have a very easy way to resolve the contradiction according to Shmuel, but we won't have a good way to resolve the contradiction according to Rav. And then we're going to be back with a difficulty with Rav. Metzia. So here's the other source. And it's going to be the exact same case in our Mishnah with one big difference. Hasho'el et ha'para. I borrowed a para from you, a cow. V'shilchalo b'yad beno b'yad shlucho chayav. And you send it with your son or your agent. I'm responsible. B'yad, right? And this is assuming, right, either I agreed or something like that. But b'yad avdo patur. But if you send it with your slave, I'm actually exempt. So without getting into the details, right, it's obviously a case where I accepted it upon myself. But the point is, we distinguish here between an eved and the other people, the son and the agent. Why? Because yad eved ki yad rabo, you send it with your slave, it's as if it's your own. So bishlam the Shmuel. Now, we have a contradiction, because the Mishnah says with your eved, it's the same as everyone else. And the Braita says with the eved, it's different, because yad eved ki yad rabo. Doesn't say those words, but we assume. So bishlam the Shmuel manitim be'eved ivri, Braita be'eved knani. Sorry, wait, did I just say something wrong? B'yad avdo, sho'el tapara v'shalchalo b'yad beno b'yad shlucho chayav, b'yad avdo. Right, b'yad avdo, you're going to be patur because it's an extension of the owner. Okay. So bishlam of the Shmuel manita be'eved ivri Braita be'eved knani. So for Shmuel, it's going to be very easy. Shmuel said our Mishnah is in an eved ivri case. Eved ivri is a different person. It's just like sending with an agent. But eved knani, the shul is not going to be chayav because you're just an extension of the master. And therefore, right, the eved knani is an extension of the master, and therefore it's as if it's still in the hands of the master. The borrower is not going to assume responsibility. So that's a very easy way to resolve these two approaches, right? They're not two approaches. These two sources basically are describing different situations, different avadim. And it's very confusing. I mean, we have this a lot in the Gemara, where the Gemara wasn't clear, or the Braita or the Mishnayot weren't clear. Had they just said Eved Ivri, Eved Knani, it would have resolved a lot of things. They just said Eved, thinking we know what they're talking about, even though obviously it's confusing. Ela l'Rav Kashya. But to Rav, how can we resolve this? If the Mishnah is talking about Eved Knani, obviously the Braita is talking about Eved Knani, and the law is the opposite. So how can we explain this? Well, Amar l'cha Rav, we're going to explain. We're going to put words in Rav's mouth. Now, beforehand, what did we say? If I, as the borrower, agree that you could send it with your Eved Knani, it's as if I said, these are the key words, it's as if I said, hit it with a stick and let it come to me on its own, because I'm basically saying I'm ready to accept responsibility. even if you're sending it with someone who's theoretically an extension of yourself, right? Obviously, if the lender, him or herself, brought it to me, I wouldn't be liable. But since you're sending it with someone else, it's as if I'm assuming responsibility as soon as you give it over to them. But Rav is now getting, again, Amar L'cha Rav means we're going to put words in Rav's mouth. We don't really know what Rav would answer because Rav's not here to answer our question, but he could say the following. Lo tema, don't say like you thought I said. Naaseh ki amar le. It's as if you said. Anytime I agree that you can send it with your slave, it's as if I said hit it with a stick and let it come. Ela ema, but what we're going to do to the Mishnah is what we call an ukimta. What's an ukimta? We're going to say that the Mishnah was talking about a particular situation. Not that anytime you give it to an eved, it's as if you said hit it with a stick and let it come. It's be'amar le, when you did say the words hikisha b'makel v'itavo, meaning when the Mishnah says that if you send it with your eved, I'm going to be responsible if I agreed to that. It's only if when I agreed to it, I said, and you can even hit it with a stick and let it come to me, which was an acceptance of responsibility beyond what I normally would be responsible for. And then I will be responsible. But if you sent it with your eved, and I didn't say, hit it with a stick, I just said, sure, send it with your eved, well, yad eved ki yad rabo, and it's as if it's still in your hands. It's as if I said to you, you bring it to me yourself. If you bring it to me yourself, obviously I'm not responsible for onus until it gets to me. So that's how we're going to resolve the difficulty. And how can we further prove this to Itmar? Well, in fact, it was said, Hishilani paratcha, va'amar le biyabni. So here is a statement that says, and we're going to quote Rav as commenting on this case, I say, please lend me your cow. Va'amar le biyabni, and you said, who should I send it with? Va'amar le hikisha b'makel v'tavo, and I say, hit it with a stick and it'll come on its own. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, Amar Rav, Kevan she'yatzah mireshut mash'il v'meita chayav. So Rav was quoted as having said, as soon as it leaves the domain of the mash'il, which would be like our case, if I said hikisha b'makel v'tavo, and then you gave it to your eved to give it to me, that's enough of it having left your domain to say that I'm actually going to be chayav. So Rav in this statement this doesn't fully prove it. Rav didn't say if you give it to the eved, but Rav basically said that as soon as you say those words, it's like magic words of saying, I accept responsibility. And then it doesn't matter who you send it with, because as soon as, right, it just has to leave your domain, right? So there's yad eved ki yad rabo. On a halachic plane, the eved is like you. But on a different plane, the eved is not really like you because the eved is a different person. So in the event that I said, hit it with a stick and let it come to me, then if it goes to the eved's hand, then we view that as it already left your domain and I've accepted responsibility. So while we thought that Rav meant in any case you send it with your eved, you're going to be chayav your eved Canaanite, now we learn that the only way to really explain Rav is not any case. We don't view any situation when you passed it on to your eved as if I said, hit it with a stick and let it come, because I agreed to let you send it with your eved. No. If you send it with your eved and I agreed to it, it's actually considered an extension of you. I don't bear responsibility. But if I said, prod it along, let it come on its own, and then you send it with your eved, as soon as it leaves your domain and the eved takes it, already I'm going to be liable for damages. And that's how Rav explains our Mishnah. Now we want to try to bring a proof from a Tannaitic source, which is going to say the exact thing that Rav just said a second ago, but in a Braita. Name a Metzia. Let's bring this Braita to support Rav, because the Braita says exactly what we just said. Hashileni paratcha, please lend me your cow. I say, va'amar le, and you said biyadni, who should I send it with? Va'amar le, hikishav makel v'itavo, and I said, hit it with a stick and let it come. Kevan she'yatzah mireshut mash'il v'meita chayav. As soon as it leaves the domain of the mash'il and it dies, I'm liable. So now, shouldn't this prove our case? Because if, again, this should prove Rav, or it could be a support for Rav, because here we have a situation that's, right, if our Mishnah is talking about, like our Mishnah, we could explain as talking about that. But Rav Ashi says no, because you could explain that this Braita is in a unique situation. Again, a type of ukimta. What could be the case? He's not saying this is the case of the Braita, but it could be. You can understand this case differently. It could be kigon. It could be we're talking about where both of us live in an alley, let's say, and your house is on the inside and my house is on the outside. And then I say, oh, just prod it with a stick and it'll come to me, because there's nowhere else the cow could go except to my house. It can't go out without passing through my house. So maybe in that, because basically what Rav Ashi is saying is, to say that anytime someone says, prod it with a stick and it'll come to me, the person's accepting responsibility is kind of absurd. Because if we live 5 blocks away and I say, oh, just tell your cow to come to me, it's not like your cow knows the way to my house. And so many things can happen on the way. It's crazy to think that I would actually assume responsibility for that. So Rav Ashi says that perhaps this braita is talking about a case where the cow has nowhere else to go but into my property. Cow wants to run out into the street, it has to walk right through my property. And that's why I was willing to accept responsibility of unexpected circumstances, right? And onus damages, because there was no choice of the animal coming to me other than going anywhere other than me. To which the Gemara says, so here, so let's read it again. The courtyard of the shoel was lifnim mechatzeiro shel mash'il, was inside the chatzer of the mash'il. Okay, so maybe it's actually saying it differently than I said now. I think about it. Chatzeiro of mine was inside the chatzer of the mash'il. But that's why I imagine it the opposite. I see. Okay. Rashi says it. Sorry, Rashi says it differently than I do, which is no one goes into the shoel unless through the lender. And then Mishamdu, right? I see. It's the opposite. The lender is living on the outside. The borrower is living on the inside, and therefore if the mash'il puts the cow in the direction toward the inside, there's nowhere else to go except to that person's house. It's different than I said, although theoretically it would be the same in the case I discussed possibly. But there's nowhere, if you put the animal in that direction, that's the only place they could go, because I'm the only show in town here. Okay, so now the kimshacha, right? Because when you send it, vaday lahatamazla, to which the Gemara says, well, then why do you need a braita to tell us this? Obviously, if I say, send the cow, and you put the cow facing my house, obviously I accept responsibility. If I told you, send it that way, and the cow's coming to me, there's really nothing unique about this. Why would the braita tell us something totally obvious? To which they say, lo tzricha, it's needed for this. Di'ika gaziata. If there's all sorts of nooks and crannies and hiding places where the animal could go in between where your courtyard ends and my courtyard starts, which means theoretically all sorts of things could happen to the animal on the way, and the animal could hang out somewhere, get stuck there, and that's the chidush. Even when there's all those things, you might have thought that I didn't, now what's smichutat? That I didn't really intend to assume responsibility. Because again, what's this all about? As we said before, this isn't the law. By law, I don't need to do this, but I don't need to accept responsibility at that stage. But I did. I said, I'm accepting responsibility. That's why they call it like a guarantor. A guarantor is not getting anything out of the loan, but agrees, I'll guarantee the loan. And he's saying, I'm willing to take upon responsibility. So this shoel is agreeing to take responsibility, even though theoretically, right, damages could happen before it even gets to their hands. But you might have thought, since there's all these possibilities of where it might go, and it might not come directly to me, just like if it's 5 blocks away, it might not make it to me. And we assume it didn't accept responsibility for that. So, right, you might have thought, lo samchadate, I didn't really mean it, what I said. Maybe it'll get stuck in one of those areas and it won't ever come to me. Kamashmalan, the Bright is telling you, no, to samchadate. If I say, and the house, right, the only way it could go if it's in that direction is to me, even though it could delay along the way and go into all sorts of other spots, still, I've assumed responsibility. Okay, so that was all just to explain this possible source that we thought could prove Rav. In the end, we say, no, it's not proving Rav because it's talking about a different situation or a unique situation. Okay, and again, where did we start? We had a machloket Rav and Shmuel. Is the Mishna talking about an Eved Ivri or an Eved Canaanite? Shmuel was very simple. Rav was much more complicated till we actually understood what he said. And the only way to explain Rav really is to explain that our Mishnah is in a case where there's more than what it just says in the Mishnah, which is, I said, you can even hit it with a stick and send it. That's when I'll be responsible if you give it to your Eved. But if I didn't say that, I won't be responsible from the time you gave it to your Eved, because your Eved is really an extension of you. Amar Rav Huna. Now we're going to get to a different halacha, which we think is talking about the same issue, but immediately we're going to realize it clearly isn't. And then we're going to get onto a totally different topic. Again, within shoel, it's not totally different, but it's not our issue. Amar Rav Huna, Hashoel kardom, and our issue is, when does a shoel assume responsibility for ones damages? At what point? When you're sending it with an agent. Now we have a case. There's no agent or anything. Hashoel kardom chaviro. I borrow a shovel or an axe, some sort of implement from my friend. Bikabo knao. Lo bikabo lo knao. Once I start using it, then I acquire it. If I didn't ever use it and it sat on my shelf, I didn't acquire it. Okay, acquire it for what? Lemai, for what? If we're talking about I acquired this object to assume responsibility for unexpected damages, Mishna para de mishat she'ela. What do we learn about the para in our Mishnah? It's from the moment you borrowed it. Now, we had a difficulty discussing what's the moment you borrowed it when you send it with an agent. But, at minimum, if I hold it into my domain, for sure it's mine and I'm responsible for damages. So if it's sat on my shelf, what would that make a difference when it comes to honest damages? Of course, I'm responsible. So we thought that this issue was talking about our topic, but it's clearly not talking about when does the shoel assume responsibility for damages. So if so, what is it talking about? A different issue. Ela lechazara. It's used for saying, when can you change your mind and say, you know what? I thought I wanted to lend this to you, but in fact, I'm not interested in loaning it to you. At what point can you change your mind? Until what point can you change your mind? So, bikabo lo matzeh hadran mashil. Once I start using it, you can't change your mind about it. It's too late. Lo bikabo, but if I didn't use it yet and it's just sitting on my shelf, matzeh mashil hadran. You can actually change your mind about it. And that's what Rav Huna is saying. And now we're going to point out, so again, this had nothing to do with our topic. This is until what point is the lender allowed to say, I decided not to lend it to you. So as long as I haven't started using it, Rav Huna says, it doesn't matter. It's in my domain. It doesn't matter. I did Mashiach, I did a Kinyan. It makes no difference. You can still change your mind, right? As opposed to a sale. In a sale, as soon as I pull the object, it's mine. You can't change your mind about it. But here in borrowing, you can. But Pliga to Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami disagrees with this. He disagrees with Rabbi Ami, and we're going to prove it from some other source that Rabbi Ami talks about, which is actually, we're going to learn now. Hamashil kardom shel hekdesh ma'alafi tovat hana'ashabo. If you lend me your kardom, okay, thank you, Ruth, for giving me the translation of hatchet. You give me your hatchet. You lend it to me, but it was hekdesh. Now, you didn't know, you didn't remember that it was sanctified. But it was sanctified to the temple. Now, what happens when and we're going to talk about this in a few different contexts today, you forget that it's hekdesh, you give it to me. Now, as soon as you give it to me, okay, ma'al, as soon as you pass it to me, you're already obligated for me'ilah. What's me'ilah? Misuse of consecrated objects by accident, right? You didn't realize. So you're usually obligated when you benefit from it. Now, why did you benefit? You loaned it to me. What benefit is there? Well, there is benefit. Lafi tovat hana'ashabo, and this is just human nature. You do a favor for me. That means you lent me something. Well, that means next time you need something, I'll have to do something for you. Right? Tit for tat. This is how the world works. So there's a benefit for you in lending it to me. Now, at what moment do you consider lending it to me? According to this, the moment you give it to me. Okay, as opposed to what Rav Huna was saying, which is it's the moment I start using it. Until I start using it, you could change your mind about it, right? So let's keep going, and then we'll explain it all. We'll spell it out. So as soon as you give it to me, you're liable for me'ilah. Now, two things happen when you do me'ilah. One is you become obligated to pay the value of the item you used, an added fifth, and you have to bring a sacrifice, asha me'ilot, guilt offering. The second thing is that item, you remove the sanctity from the item. As soon as you use it, that item becomes no longer sanctified because you turned it into chulin. Okay, so it's one of the things that happen when someone misuses consecrated property. The sanctity leaves the item. It becomes chulin. Well, let's think of the situation. You gave me your hatchet. As soon as you gave it to me, since you benefited, because now I'll have to do you a favor later, or potentially, right, even if I don't do you the favor, by the way, you benefited from knowing that if you ever need a favor from me, you're going to come to me. That's the case, then the hekdesh leaves it. I'm now left with a hatchet that I can use for anything I want. And therefore, it continues and says, I can now use it as a hatchet, do whatever I want with it because it's cool and it's not sanctified. Now, Ilo kana'o, okay, here come our questions. If Rabbi Ami agreed with Rav Huna, then it's not really, I didn't really acquire it. So you shouldn't have me'ila, because if you could still change your mind about it, then there's no real kinyan yet. That means there's no kinyan by me pulling it. Ilo kna'o amay ma'al. So why should you be chayav in me'ila? Nothing happened, because you could just take it back. And furthermore, if you could change your mind about it, and this is sanctified, why on earth will we let me use it? We should just say that you should change your mind about it. Say, oh, listen, I didn't really want to lend it to you. I'll have to return it. And if I return it, then it turns out there was no misuse of consecrated property. We'd always rather avoid misuse of consecrated property. So if Rav Huna is right, okay, or it doesn't matter right or wrong, if Rabbi Ami thought that Rav Huna was right, then he wouldn't have said anything he said. So it must be he disagrees, and he thinks that the moment you transfer it to the other person, the lender gives it to the borrower acquires it. To the extent, right, not just for onsim, which we learned before, but also for chazara, that you can't change your mind about it. Otherwise, there would be no me'ila, and I wouldn't be allowed to use the hatchet. Upliga de Rabbi Elazar. And also, Rav Huna disagrees with Rabbi Elazar, who's going to say explicitly, what's the moment that you acquire this object? The Amar Rabbi Elazar, just like when I buy something. When do I acquire it? When I pull the item toward me, or I just pull it. Same thing with shomrim, including a shoel, right? Therefore, once I pull it, you can't renege on the agreement. So here you see two people stand in contradiction to Rav Huna. We have a difference of opinion. Is the act of me pulling the item when I borrow it already mine and you can't change your mind? Or according to Rav Huna, no, it's not until I actually use it. Tanya Nami Hachi, here's a bright to support Rabbi Elazar. That is word for word what he said. It's all about, right, when you pull it. Ukeshem, and by the way, this bright to add something else, which is not connected at all, although a bit of a lead into Bava Batra, which is our next Masechet. Just like land is acquired not by pulling, you can't pull land. How do you acquire it then? Either by paying money, which doesn't work for movables, but it does work for land. When you pay the money, when you sign a document about it, or chazaka, which is living on the land for 3 years without the owner complaining at all and saying, what are you doing on my land? You've lived there for 3 years and no one complains, the land becomes yours. So just like that works for land, kach schirut, it also works for rental. So we compared buying and schirut, and we talked about the shomrim, which by the way includes renting, and we talked about land and schirut. So the Gemara says schirut ma'avidite. How could you say schirut? Now schirut could be renting land. It could be renting a movable item. They say, how could you possibly acquire a movable item that you're renting through money, document, or chazaka? That makes no sense. To which Amar of Chisda schirut karka. Obviously, when they said schirut here, they didn't mean renting a movable object. They obviously meant rental of land. They were trying to say is purchasing land has the same rules of acquiring as renting of land does. Obviously, you don't acquire it permanently. You acquire it temporarily while you're renting it. Okay, that's the end of that section. Now we're going to start. Okay, I guess I forgot to mention, it seems like we're at Amud Bet now. Shmuel, we're at the fourth line on Amud Bet. Amar Shmuel. Why this comes up is unclear. It doesn't really seem to have to do with our sugya, but it seems at least in one head, there's one overlap, which is we talked about me'ila and the value and misuse of consecrated property, and Shmuel is going to discuss also misuse of consecrated property. So perhaps that's why the sugya is here. Amar Shmuel, Haima de gazel chavitza de tamre mechavre, v'ibe chamishim tamre. We've talked about this igulei dvela, which is a pressed fig cake. Okay, figs and dates are both very sticky, and they would make these pressed cakes of them. So this is a pressed date cake. So you have a pressed date cake, and someone steals it. Now there's 50 dates in this cake. If you sell the whole cake as one, you sell it for 49 zuzim. But if you separate each of the dates and you sell them one at a time, you sell it for 50, right? This is classic, right? You buy a box of cookies, you could buy it for, X amount of money. But if you sell each cookie individually, right? Like let's say you go into a school and you start selling cookies one at a time, you can sell those, 20 cookies that in a package cost one thing, but one at a time it's going to cost more. So if someone steals it, how do we evaluate which do you pay? Do you pay the higher price, the price in bulk, or do you pay the individual price? So Shmuel says, if it's to an individual, then you pay the lower price. 50 means 50 minus 1. Okay, why they say it like that? A lot of times, like malkot is 40 minus 1. Okay, they say a lot. It's just the way they spoke in those days. So you pay 50 minus 1, meaning you pay the lower price. But lahekdesh, if it was misuse of consecrated property, you have to pay back the temple, you're going mishalem 50 b'chum shayu. You're going to have to pay 50 plus, because that's the law of Me'ila, you have to add an extra fifth. Okay? Masha ein came b'mazik. Here's just a side point. Okay, I don't want you to get too distracted by this, but a side point is, if you had damaged the hekdesh, that wouldn't be true. It's only because you ate the hekdesh, okay, and destroyed it and like completely ate it, but not if you damaged it. Okay, let's say you stepped on that. Okay, it would be different. You just wouldn't have the fifth. You'd still go by the higher price because it's hekdesh, but you wouldn't have to pay the fifth. How do we know that? That's a totally side issue. I mean, this whole sugya is a side issue because it wasn't germane to our topic, but this is really not germane to what we're learning right now. But to Amar Mar, Ish ki yochal kodesh, this is a pasuk that talks about a person who eats truma if they're not a kohen. It says, bishkaga, you ate it by accident. I'm just reading you the pasuk, it's not quoted here. You add a fifth. Now the drasha in this pasuk, okay, the key word that I kind of just quickly said, if you eat kodesh, if you eat truma, you have to add a fifth besides paying the value. Prat lemazik, so they say yochal, if you eat it, but that comes to exclude someone who damages. Damages don't, if you damage consecrated property, which could be truma, could be something sanctified to the temple, you don't have to pay the fifth. Okay, but the main thing we're trying to say is hekdesh and hedyot are different. If there's an item that could be priced in two different ways, we're going to go by the higher price for hekdesh, the lower price for hedyot, for a regular individual. We're going to have two questions on this. Matkefla Rabbi Barabai. Lehedyot, amay mishalem 50 nechechada. I don't understand why for a hedyot you should pay the lower price. Can't the person you steal from me and you end up paying me 49. Now I say, but I was planning to sell them one at a time. You should pay me the higher price. Why should I lose out? To which they say, Amar Rafuna Berei Rav Yoshua. What do you mean? We have a paradigm for this. And you might remember this from Bava Kama. Shamin Metzia be'ota sadeh tzna. There's a Mishna that says that when you go to pay damages, this is, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's when your animal eats, nizakin deshen. If the animal eats food in someone else's property, how do we assess the damages? There's two ways to assess the damages to the crops. Okay, let's say they ate a field of a beit se'ah. So what do? There's two ways to do it. Either I could say, okay, beit se'ah is the amount, right? A field the size that could produce X amount of produce. So I could say, what's the value if I were to buy a piece of land that could grow a se'ah? What's that valued at? That's a certain value. But that's not the way we evaluate damages. We go by the lower price. What's the lower price? We take, if let's say your animal came into my field and ate a certain amount of square meters worth of a section, right? There was X square meters. What we do is we say the following. It's in a bigger field and the animal didn't eat everything in my field. So we evaluate. What's the price of my field had the crops still been there? What's the price of the field today now that I'm missing that certain area of crops? And the formula there, that minus that is going to be, right, the difference is going to be what you have to pay me. Now, what we're basically saying is we view, that's called shamin, we evaluate the beit se'ah be'ota sadeh. We evaluate that size within the field that it's in, which means how much did it cause my field to depreciate in value? Not how much is it worth on its own if we were to sell it on its own, which is a much higher price, a much lower price here. So here you see when it comes to damages, you pay the lower price and that answers our question. That's why in damages, as long as it's a hedyot, we pay the lower. That was question number one. Question number two is going to be a little longer, which is, L'meimer de Savar Shmuel din hedio lav kedin gavo adam? Are you trying to say that Shmuel's whole theory was we're going to distinguish between hekdesh and hedyot? While we're going to be strict when it comes to hekdesh, we're not going to apply that same stringency to a hedyot. Hedyot, as we just said a minute ago, is going to be like regular lots of damages. Hekdesh is going to be unique, that we're going to make it more strict. But are you saying that Shmuel doesn't learn from hekdesh to hedyot, saying basically if we have some law by hekdesh, that's only true for hekdesh, not for hedyot? But Shmuel says the opposite somewhere else. And let's see. So it could be that this is why this came up in our sugya, because Shmuel is going to now discuss a law of Me'ilah here, okay, as he did in the beginning and also now, and evaluating the value of Me'ilah, right? So now, the Mishnah says, Natal Evan Okora Mehekdesh. Okay, this is sugya Me'ilah. We actually saw it in Chagiga and Bava, so it might sound familiar. If you take an Evan or a beam of hekdesh, and let's say I'm the treasurer of the temple. So I have regular things in my house that are my own items, and I have hekdesh items. Now, sometimes you could imagine I get confused. So if I take a stone or a beam that belongs to the temple, because someone sanctified it, brought it to my house for me to bring to the temple, and I pick it up in my house, and I plan to use it, but I don't use it. Just by picking it up, lo ma'al, that's not called, even though I was planning to use it for something not sanctified, not sacred, that's not called, by me picking it up, since, I have hekdesh stuff in my house anyway, that's not called using it. Nitana lechavero, but what if I give it to you as a gift or whatever? Let's say I just give it to you. As soon as now this gets all into kinyanim, which we've talked about multiple times, which is as soon as I pass it to somebody else. So again, what happens with Me'ilah? Number one, that's already called that I've used it because I gave it to you, which I got benefit from, either, favor, tovan hana or something, and maybe that's also a similarity. Kuma'al, so therefore, I'm liable in Me'ilah. The chavero lo ma'al. Now, when you use that item, you can use it. There's no Me'ilah because what happens, remember, as soon as I use it for something not sacred by giving it to you as a gift, then, or however I gave it to you, then the hekdesh leaves it. It's not sanctified anymore, so you can do whatever you want with it. Okay, but that's not important yet. This is the case we're going to be interested in. Bina'ah betoch beto. Okay, and there, when they learn this, they explain, what are we talking about? I used it to close up my chimney or something. I took this stone and I stuck it in the hole of my chimney or skylight, or I had some sort of opening in the roof. I put this in the spot. Now, what happens here? This is not, I didn't smooth out the stone and get it ready and cement it into my wall. That would be what we call shinoi. Shinoi, I change the item, then it becomes mine. But in this case, I just stuck it in a place where theoretically I could take it out, okay, without, nothing happened to it. It didn't change in shape, it didn't change in form, and it's not stuck there. So if I did that and I used it in that way, lo ma'al, I'm still not mo'el because I didn't do anything really yet. Well, what's the issue? In order to chayv a me'ilah, you have to benefit. Okay, we didn't talk about this, but obviously that was the whole thing, that you benefited because you gave a gift, a favor. You did a favor with someone that benefited you. So there has to be benefit. So when do I benefit? When am I liable in me'ilah? I have to live underneath it. Okay, let's say I had this opening in my ceiling and I wanted to close it up. I couldn't live there because the rain was coming in. So I closed it with this stone. And now I'm enjoying it because now it's raining and I now got benefit. And, we have to evaluate at what point becomes benefit of a pruta. But let's say we have some formula for how we do that. As soon as I benefit the value of a pruta, now I'm chayv me'ilah. So by putting it in there, no. But by benefiting from that, yes. Here comes the key line. So that's the law for me'ilah, for consecrated property. Now you would think that we can't apply this, according to Shmuel, to a regular situation. But we're going to hear what Shmuel said about this. Yativ Rabbi Yavau kamed to Rabbi Yochanan, v'yativ ka'amar mishmei de Shmuel. And now you're going to remember where we saw this in Bava Kama. Rabbi Yavau sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and he said in the name of Shmuel, Zot omeret, from here you can infer, Hadar b'chatzar chavero shalom midato tzarich la'alo sachal. If you use someone's house without them knowing, and they're not, you're benefiting, they're not losing out because they don't need their house. So let's talk about the comparison here. You're using this stone. You're not changing the stone. So you can easily take the stone out and give it to the hekdesh. Now, the hekdesh doesn't know about it. Okay, what does it mean for hekdesh? No, we'll talk about that soon. But it's like using someone's item without their knowledge. You're not depreciating it in any way. You're not changing it in any way. And what do we see here? You have to pay. So likewise, in the case of I'm benefiting from your house that you left. I'm a squatter. You're not losing anything because you weren't renting it out anyway. According to this, I would still have to pay. That's what Shmuel says. So now, what's our problem? Our problem is, Shmuel says, we take something that's by laws of Me'ilah, and we're going to apply this stringency to a regular case. And that's exactly the opposite of what he said in our case. You're not going to have the same law. We're going to be more lenient when it comes to an individual than for hekdesh. So that's our problem. Some people have the Girsa Amar Rebbe Yochanan, some people don't. We can skip it either which way. Hadran Shmuel Me'ahi. Say Shmuel changed his mind about the second thing. He doesn't think Hadar b'chatzar chavero shalom midato that you can learn from here tzarich la'alot lo sachal, to which the Gemara says umimai d'me'ahi hadar be'edo me'ha hadar. If you're going to say Shmuel changed his mind, why say he changed his mind about the second thing? Maybe he changed his mind about the first thing, and maybe he thinks you can learn from hekdesh to hedyo. So no, me'ahi hadar be'ed must be he was chozer on the second thing. Why? Kidder Rava, because what did Rava say? And it could be like Rava. Okay, it's not like Shmuel or Rava, but the point is, just like Rava says, it must be that's what Shmuel was thinking. To Amar Rava, and this is a fascinating line, hekdesh shalom midat kehedyot midat ami. You thought this was hekdesh shalom midat, and therefore you learned to a case where you're living in someone's house and they don't know. Now, it's not. Okay, number one, first of all, what does it mean to be living in someone's house with their knowledge? If you have an empty house that you're not using and I live there and you know about it and you don't stop me from living there, then that means you accepted it. And I obviously don't need to pay you, because if you wanted me to pay you, you would have said so. So this law we're talking about is only a case where you don't know. You can't compare a case where you're living in my house and I don't know about it, or I'm living in your house, you don't know about it, to a case of hekdesh shalom midat, because there is no such thing as hekdesh shalom midat. Because what is hekdesh? You're using God's property. You want to say what? Without God's knowledge? Of course, God knows everything. So there is no such thing as hekdesh shalom midat. And that's why the comparison is clearly not a good comparison, because it's more similar to hekdesh midat, right? Hekdesh shalom midat, there is no such thing really. It's really hekdesh midat, and then it would be more similar to midat. And that's definitely not the comparison, because if I'm living there and you know about it, I obviously don't need to pay you. And in the hekdesh case, you do need to pay. So this is not, obviously he must have changed his mind about this. Okay, so that was our case. We had Shmuel, who basically said difference in price. If it's hekdesh, you pay the higher, right? If there's two different prices, hekdesh, you pay the higher price, hedjuk, you pay the lower price. And then we said, right, we had two problems. Number one, why would you pay the lower price? Why can't they claim you owe me the 50? And then we said that's because it's like regular damages, like shame damages of an animal. Then we said, what about this contradicts Shmuel elsewhere? Oh, Shmuel changed his mind about that other thing. Now we have another case where there's differentiation in price, and we're going to see what Rava has to say about this. I'm a Rava, and with that we'll finish. There were people who were schleppers. They were carrying the barrel from place to place of this store owner, and they broke it. Now they have to replace it. Well, what's the value of this barrel? It depends what day of the week. If it's the day of the shuk, like Mondays and Thursdays, you could sell it for a higher price because there's a lot of demand, a lot of people are coming to buy, prices go up. You sell it for 5 zuz. But b'shar yomi mizdavna ba'arba. Other days of the week, it's sold for 4. So a hadrule b'yom deshuka, mahadrule chavita dechamra. If you pay it back on the day of the shuk, you can just give another barrel the same value, and that person can then sell it that day for 5. But b'shar yomi, if you return it on Tuesday, let's say, and it's not a day of the shuk, and if the person wants to get the money for it that day, they're going to lose money and they're going to only get 4 zuzim. You can't give them the barrel. You have to give them 5 zuzim because the barrel is not going to help them because they're going to get less money for it. But this, by the way, this is only if the person didn't have, when you return it on Tuesday, if on Monday they didn't have any other wine to sell, then we make you return it. But if they have wine to sell on Monday and they didn't sell it, and it's now Tuesday, and you return this barrel of wine, and yesterday they didn't sell their wine, if they were desperate for the money, they would have sold the barrel. obviously they weren't desperate for the money. So if you return it on Tuesday, obviously they could wait till Thursday, and therefore you could return a barrel and it'll just wait, they'll wait till it goes up in value. But if they didn't have any wine to sell, then you have no way to know, are they desperate for the money or not? And therefore, if you're giving them on Tuesday and maybe they need the money today, you'll have to give them 5 zuzim and not a barrel of wine, because the barrel is going to be worth less that day. But one side point, if you give them 5 zuzim instead of the barrel, you're actually saving them some money. So you can actually deduct a little money. Because if you gave them a barrel, let's say on the day of the shuk, and it was worth 5, well, they'd have to spend time trying to sell it, which is worth time is money. And they would have to open up a spout in it, which costs money. So you can, since you're saving them that money by just giving them the value of the barrel that you broke, then you actually can deduct that amount that they would have had to spend. Okay, so this is another case where there's a discrepancy in price, but this is depending on the day. So it's different than what we talked about before. Quick review of Radah. We started with the Mishna. The Eved, is the Eved Canaanite or Eved Ivri? We had the 2 different approaches, and I already reviewed that, so we'll move on. We had a machloket between Rav Huna versus Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Elazar about the borrowing, what the moment that determines when the lender can't change their mind about it or not. Is it once you use it, or is it once you actually pull it? Okay, and from there we got into pulling and all that, and then we got into stealing. So you steal something that has 2 different prices, and we talked about 2 different values. Basically, Shmuel distinguished between hekdesh and hedyot. Then we had trouble with that. We had 2 questions, which I just reviewed a minute ago, so we're not going to review that again. And then Rava talked about what if it has different prices on different days, and then it depends on what day you return it, but it also depends on whether the person can wait or can't wait, and that is determined by if they have one on the day of the shuk and didn't sell it, then you can actually just give them a barrel and they can wait till, it's obvious they could wait till the next day of the shuk. Okay, with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Shishma b'salat tova.